They say you never really know someone until they're gone. I thought I knew my father better than anyone. Detective Frank Martinez, badge number 2847, 28 years of service, decorated officer, my personal hero. I was wrong about everything. This is the story of how I discovered that the man who taught me right from wrong had committed the most unforgivable sin of all, destroying an innocent man's life to save his own career. My name is Sarah Martinez, and 6 months ago, I was just another victim's advocate trying to help families find justice. I believed in the system because I believed in my father. He died of a heart attack 3 years ago, and I'd been putting off going through his things. Too painful, too final. If I'd known what I was going to find in that storage unit, I might have left those boxes sealed forever. It was a Saturday morning in March when I finally drove to that storage facility on the outskirts of town. Unit 247, I still remember the number. The musty smell hit me as soon as I rolled up the metal door. 28 years of a police career packed into cardboard boxes and plastic containers. I started with the easy stuff: old uniforms, commendation plaques, photos from retirement parties. Normal things that normal fathers keep. Then I found the manila envelope. It was wedged between 2 photo albums, marked in my father's handwriting, "Confidential, do not open." The tape was old, yellowed, but still sealed tight. My hands were shaking as I tore it open, and I had no idea why. Maybe some part of me already knew that whatever was inside would change everything. The first thing I saw was a crime scene photo of a young black woman lying in an alley. Janet Collins, according to the file tab. 24 years old, mother of a 3-year-old daughter. Stabbed during what appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. The case was from 1999, and I remembered my father talking about it. He'd solved it quickly, arrested a man named Marcus Washington within 48 hours. It had been one of his proudest moments. But as I dug deeper into the file, nothing made sense. There were witness statements with whiteout corrections, evidence logs with timestamps that didn't align, and photographs that seemed to tell a different story than the official report. And then, at the bottom of the envelope, folded into a small square like someone was trying to hide it even from themselves, I found a handwritten note in my father's unmistakable scrawl. The words are burned into my memory: "I planted the knife in Marcus Washington's car. The real killer was Tommy Vasquez, my CI. Couldn't let him go down or my whole network would collapse. The department needed this case closed. I needed this case closed. Marcus was in the wrong place at the wrong time, had priors, fit the profile. I told myself he probably did something else anyway. I told myself a lot of things. May God forgive me, because I can't forgive myself." I read those words over and over again, hoping they would change, hoping I was misunderstanding something. But there was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. My father had framed an innocent man for murder. Marcus Washington had spent over 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, while the real killer, Tommy Vasquez, had remained free under my father's protection. The room started spinning. I had to sit down on a dusty box of Christmas decorations, trying to process what I'd just learned. This was the man who taught me to always tell the truth, who said that integrity was the most important thing a person could have. This was the man whose stories of catching bad guys had inspired me to work in victim services. And he was the bad guy. I drove home in a daze, the envelope sitting on my passenger seat like a bomb waiting to explode. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything else. I kept hoping I'd wake up and discover it was all a nightmare. But every time I looked at that confession, the reality hit me again. My father had destroyed an innocent man's life. For 3 days, I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. I researched Marcus Washington obsessively, learning everything I could about the man my father had betrayed. Born and raised in North Memphis, high school dropout, a few minor arrests for possession and petty theft. Nothing violent, nothing that suggested he was capable of murder. He'd been working at an auto parts store when Janet Collins was killed, trying to turn his life around. The more I learned about Marcus, the more human he became. He had a daughter, Keisha, who was just 5 years old when he was arrested. She grew up believing her father was a killer, carried that shame her entire childhood. Marcus had maintained his innocence for over 2 decades, filing appeal after appeal, but no one would listen. Why would they? He had a record. He was young and black in 1999 Memphis, and a decorated detective had built what seemed like a solid case against him. But it was all lies. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every seemingly damning detail, it was all carefully constructed fiction designed to protect the real killer and my father's reputation. I finally called the Innocence Project on a Thursday morning. My voice was shaking as I explained to attorney David Chen what I'd found. There was a long silence after I finished talking, and I wondered if he thought I was crazy or lying. Finally, he said the words that made it all real: "If this confession is authentic, Sarah, we're looking at one of the most egregious cases of police misconduct I've ever seen." The next few weeks were a blur of meetings with lawyers, document analysis, and the horrible realization that I was about to destroy my father's legacy. Friends and family members who'd known him as Detective Frank Martinez, hero cop, were going to learn the truth. My mother, who'd been married to him for 35 years, was going to discover that her husband was a criminal. His former partner, his captain, his friends, they were all going to have to confront the fact that they'd been living a lie. But none of that mattered compared to what Marcus Washington had endured. While I was growing up in a middle-class home with 2 loving parents, he was locked in a cell for a crime he didn't commit. While I was graduating from college and starting my career, he was filing appeals and begging people to believe his innocence. While I was building a life based on the values my father claimed to represent, Marcus was losing everything: his freedom, his daughter's childhood, his mother's final years. The hardest part was going to see him. The Innocence Project arranged for me to visit Marcus at Millfield Correctional Facility, where he'd spent the last 23 years of his life. I'd never been inside a prison before, and the sound of metal doors slamming shut behind me made my stomach turn. How had Marcus endured this for over 2 decades? He was smaller than I'd expected, worn down by years of imprisonment but still carrying himself with a dignity that I found humbling. When I told him who I was and why I was there, his reaction wasn't anger or bitterness, it was disbelief. "You're telling me Frank Martinez's daughter is here to help prove my innocence?" he asked. "After all these years, it's his own child who's going to set the record straight." Marcus told me about his life before the arrest, how he'd been trying to clean up his act after a few minor scrapes with the law. He'd gotten a job at the auto parts store, was saving money to get his own apartment so Keisha could visit more often. He remembered the night Janet Collins died because he'd worked a double shift and gotten home exhausted. He had an alibi, but it was weak, just his word and that of his girlfriend at the time, who had her own credibility issues. When the police came for him 2 days later, Marcus thought there had been some mistake. He'd never even heard of Janet Collins. But my father had built a compelling case: the murder weapon with Marcus's fingerprints, witness statements placing him near the scene, a motive based on Janet's supposed connection to drug dealers Marcus allegedly knew. It was all fabricated, but it was convincing enough to secure a conviction. "I stopped trying to prove my innocence about 10 years ago," Marcus told me during that first visit. "I realized that nobody cared about the truth anymore. They had their story, they had their conviction, case closed. I just tried to survive each day and maybe see my daughter when she was willing to visit, which wasn't often." The legal process of getting Marcus's conviction overturned was complex and emotionally devastating. David Chen and his team had to prove not only that my father had planted evidence, but that the entire case had been built on lies. They brought in handwriting experts to authenticate the confession, forensic specialists to re-examine the physical evidence, and investigators to track down witnesses from 24 years ago. Some of the original witnesses had died, others had moved away or couldn't be located. But enough pieces came together to paint a clear picture of what had really happened on the night Janet Collins was murdered. Tommy Vasquez, my father's confidential informant, had been desperate for drug money. He'd followed Janet after her shift at the diner where she worked, intending to rob her. When she fought back, he panicked and stabbed her. Tommy called my father immediately after the murder, not to confess but to ask for help. And my father made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He chose to protect his informant rather than seek justice for Janet Collins. He helped Tommy dispose of evidence, coached him on what to say if questioned, and then systematically built a case against Marcus Washington to deflect attention from the real killer. The knife used to kill Janet was planted in Marcus's car using gloves to preserve Tommy's fingerprints while adding Marcus's prints from his booking process. Witness statements were altered to change descriptions of the suspect from Tommy's appearance to Marcus's. Security camera footage that would have exonerated Marcus was mysteriously lost. It was a masterclass in evidence manipulation, carried out by someone who knew exactly how the system worked. Tommy Vasquez died of a drug overdose just 8 months after Janet's murder, taking the complete truth to his grave. But he'd confessed to a friend before he died, and that friend finally came forward when news of Marcus's case broke. Tommy told me he killed that woman in the alley, the friend testified. Said Detective Martinez helped cover it up in exchange for information on bigger cases. Tommy felt guilty about it, started using more to deal with the guilt. That's what killed him in the end. The revelation that my father had prioritized his clearance rate and his network of informants over justice for a murdered woman was devastating. But it got worse. As news of the case spread, other inmates began reaching out with stories about Detective Frank Martinez. How many other cases had he tainted? How many other innocent people were sitting in prison because my father had decided their lives were expendable? The district attorney's office launched a review of every case my father had worked in his 28-year career. They found irregularities in dozens of cases, patterns of evidence that seemed too convenient, witness statements that had been subtly altered. Most of the cases were too old to overturn, the evidence too degraded or witnesses too scattered to rebuild. But the scope of potential misconduct was staggering. Meanwhile, I was dealing with the personal fallout of exposing my father's crimes. My mother went through a period of denial, insisting that someone else must have written that confession, that her husband could never have done such things. When the handwriting analysis confirmed it was authentic, she fell into a deep depression that lasted months. 35 years of marriage, she told me. How could I not know what kind of man I was living with? My father's former colleagues were equally devastated, but some channeled their shock into anger directed at me. Captain Reynolds, who'd worked with my father for 15 years, accused me of betraying my family and destroying a good man's reputation based on questionable evidence. Your father solved more murders than anyone in this department, he told me during a heated confrontation. Now you want to tear down his legacy over some old paperwork. But I wasn't tearing down my father's legacy, I was revealing what his legacy actually was. It wasn't the decorated detective who always got his man, it was the corrupt cop who was willing to destroy innocent lives to protect his statistics and his sources. The real Frank Martinez wasn't the hero I'd grown up believing in, he was a man who'd lost his way and taken other people down with him. The hardest conversation was with Janet Collins's sister, Maria Santos. She'd spent 24 years believing that justice had been served for her sister's murder. Learning that the wrong man had been convicted while the real killer had died free was almost too much for her to bear. You're telling me that for over 2 decades, I've been thanking God that Janet's killer was locked up, she said, tears streaming down her face. But he was never locked up. He died a free man while Marcus Washington rotted in prison. Maria's anger was justified and overwhelming. She'd supported Marcus's execution during his original trial, believing he was the monster who'd killed her sister. Now she had to confront the fact that she'd been calling for the death of an innocent man while her sister's real killer walked free. The guilt was eating her alive, and I understood exactly how she felt. The legal proceedings took 8 months from the time I first contacted the Innocence Project to the day Marcus Washington walked out of prison a free man. Judge James Crawford delivered the ruling with the gravity the situation deserved. This case represents a catastrophic failure of our justice system. An innocent man has lost 23 years of his life because of deliberate misconduct by someone sworn to protect and serve. While we cannot restore those lost years, we can and must acknowledge this terrible wrong and do everything in our power to prevent it from happening again. I was in the courtroom that day, watching as Marcus heard the words he'd been waiting over 2 decades to hear: the conviction of Marcus Washington is hereby vacated, and all charges are dismissed. He didn't celebrate or cry or even smile. He just sat there for a moment, absorbing the reality that he was finally free. When he stood up, he looked directly at me and nodded, not thanks, exactly, but acknowledgement that we'd both done something difficult and necessary. Walking out of prison was surreal for Marcus. The world had changed dramatically during his incarceration. Smartphones, social media, GPS navigation, technologies that didn't exist when he was arrested were now ubiquitous. Simple tasks like using an ATM or navigating a website were overwhelming. But the hardest part wasn't adapting to new technology, it was rebuilding relationships with people who'd written him off as a killer. His daughter Keisha was 28 now, with a college degree and a successful career in social work. She'd legally changed her last name when she turned 18, trying to escape the stigma of being a murderer's daughter. Their first meeting after his release was awkward and painful, 2 people trying to bridge a gap created by years of separation and mutual hurt. "I wrote you letters when I was little," Keisha told him during one of their early conversations. "But I never sent them because I thought you'd killed that woman. I thought you were a monster who deserved to be locked up. I'm sorry, Daddy. I'm sorry I didn't believe you." Marcus's forgiveness was immediate and complete. "You were a child," he told her. "You believed what everyone else believed because that's what children do. I never blamed you for that, not once in 23 years. I just hoped that someday you'd know the truth." The state awarded Marcus $4.2 million in compensation for his wrongful conviction, a sum that sounds substantial but can't possibly account for what he lost. How do you put a price on missing your daughter's childhood? On not being there when your mother died? On spending your prime adult years locked in a cell for a crime you didn't commit? The money helped with practical concerns like housing and healthcare, but it couldn't heal the deeper wounds. Marcus used part of his settlement to start a non-profit organization dedicated to helping formerly incarcerated individuals reintegrate into society. His lived experience with the challenges of re-entry made him uniquely qualified to help others navigate the system. "Prison teaches you patience," he would tell the men and women he worked with. "But freedom teaches you hope, and hope is what keeps you going when everything seems impossible." Meanwhile, I was dealing with my own form of rebuilding. I'd lost my job as a victim's advocate when my employer decided that my involvement in exposing police corruption created too much controversy for their organization. Some of my colleagues supported my decision to come forward, but others felt I betrayed the law enforcement community that my agency worked closely with. The professional consequences were difficult, but the personal ones were harder. Friends who'd known my father avoided me, uncomfortable with the cognitive dissonance of reconciling Detective Frank Martinez, beloved figure, with Frank Martinez, corrupt cop who framed innocent people. Family gatherings became tense affairs where my father's name couldn't be mentioned without creating awkward silences or heated arguments. But I also discovered support in unexpected places. Other families of wrongfully convicted individuals reached out, sharing their stories and offering encouragement. Criminal justice reform advocates embraced me as a symbol of choosing truth over loyalty, even when that choice came with significant personal cost. Slowly, I began to build a new identity that wasn't defined by my father's reputation, either the false heroic version or the ugly reality. I decided to go back to school for a law degree, inspired by my work with David Chen and the Innocence Project. If my father's crimes had taught me anything, it was that the justice system needed people willing to challenge it from within, people who understood that loyalty to truth was more important than loyalty to institutions or individuals. The broader impact of Marcus's case extended far beyond one wrongful conviction. The district attorney's office implemented new protocols for handling cases involving informants, requiring multiple levels of oversight and documentation. Police departments across the state began reviewing their own cold cases for similar patterns of misconduct. Body cameras became mandatory for all detective interviews, and independent oversight boards were established to investigate claims of police corruption. These changes came too late for Marcus and the other victims of my father's misconduct, but they represented hope for preventing future wrongful convictions. During my testimony before the state legislature about needed reforms, I shared my father's story as a cautionary tale about what happens when good people make bad choices and systems fail to provide adequate oversight. My father wasn't born corrupt, I told the legislators. He was a decorated officer who started out wanting to serve and protect. But somewhere along the way, he began to believe that the ends justified the means, that solving cases was more important than how those cases got solved. The system not only allowed this to happen, it rewarded it. We have to do better. 2 years after Marcus's release, I attended his wedding to a woman he'd met through his nonprofit work. It was a small ceremony, held in the community center where his organization operated. Watching him exchange vows with someone who'd fallen in love with the man he'd become despite everything he'd endured was profoundly moving. Here was someone who'd had every reason to become bitter and angry, but who'd chosen hope and love instead. During his wedding toast, Marcus did something that still brings tears to my eyes. He thanked me for having the courage to come forward with the truth, but then he said something I'll never forget: Sarah could have kept her father's secret and protected his memory. No one would have blamed her for choosing family loyalty over abstract justice. But she chose to do the right thing, even though it cost her everything. That kind of courage is rare, and I'm grateful that it exists in the world. The relationship between Marcus and me evolved into something unique, not quite friendship, because our connection was built on tragedy, but something deeper than professional collaboration. We were bound together by shared experience with the aftermath of my father's choices, two people trying to build something positive from the wreckage of corruption and betrayal. We began speaking together at criminal justice reform conferences, sharing our story with audiences of lawyers, activists, and policymakers. The message was simple but powerful: the truth matters more than loyalty, justice matters more than convenience, and it's never too late to do the right thing, even when the cost is enormous. During one of these speaking engagements, a young police officer in the audience asked the question that gets to the heart of everything: how do we prevent this from happening again? How do we make sure other Frank Martinez situations don't occur? My answer has evolved over time, but the core remains the same: we create systems that reward integrity over results, that value accountability over loyalty, and that remember that every person, regardless of their background or past mistakes, deserves to have their case judged on truth rather than convenience. We remember that when we fail to protect the rights of those society deems disposable, we're failing everyone. Marcus's response was characteristically graceful: we remember that justice isn't about punishment or revenge, it's about truth and healing. Every time someone in power chooses personal benefit over doing what's right, they create victims. Not just the person they directly harm, but families, communities, everyone who loses faith in the system. The only way to heal that damage is with honesty and accountability, even when it's painful. 3 years after his release, Marcus and I visited Janet Collins's grave together for the first time. We brought flowers and stood in silence, two people whose lives had been forever changed by her death and the lies that followed. It was Marcus who spoke first. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," he said quietly. "I'm sorry the man who was supposed to find your real killer chose to protect him instead. I hope you can rest knowing that the truth finally came out." I added my own words: "I'm sorry my father failed you so completely. I'm sorry he chose his career over your life and Marcus's freedom. I promise that the rest of my life will be spent trying to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Standing there in that quiet cemetery, I reflected on everything that had led to that moment. My father's choices had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate victims. Janet Collins died without justice. Marcus Washington lost 23 years of his life. Keisha grew up believing her father was a killer. Maria Santos spent decades thanking God for false justice. Tommy Vasquez died without facing consequences for his crime. My mother lost her faith in the man she'd loved for 35 years. And I lost my hero, discovering that he was actually the villain in someone else's story. But from all that tragedy came something important, a commitment to truth, no matter how painful, and a determination to build systems that protect the innocent rather than protect the guilty. Marcus's case led to legislative changes that have prevented other wrongful convictions. His nonprofit has helped hundreds of formerly incarcerated individuals successfully reintegrate into society. The oversight mechanisms put in place after his exoneration have caught other cases of potential misconduct before they reached conviction. Most importantly, perhaps, Marcus and I have shown that it's possible to find meaning and purpose in even the most devastating circumstances. We've proven that people can choose courage over comfort, truth over loyalty, and justice over personal cost. We've demonstrated that it's never too late to do the right thing, even when that choice comes with enormous personal sacrifice. Today, as I prepare to graduate from law school and begin working full-time with the Innocence Project, I often think about the lessons my father actually taught me, not the ones he intended, but the ones his actions demonstrated. He showed me that good people can make terrible choices when they prioritize personal benefit over moral obligation. He showed me that institutional loyalty can become a form of corruption when it protects wrongdoing rather than preventing it. And he showed me that the courage to face uncomfortable truths, even about people we love, is one of the most important qualities a person can have. My father wanted to be remembered as a hero, someone who caught bad guys and protected innocent people. Instead, his legacy is a reminder that heroes aren't born, they're made by the choices they make when faced with difficult situations. Real heroism isn't about wearing a badge or carrying a gun, it's about choosing to do what's right even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. Marcus Washington spent 23 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit because my father chose personal convenience over justice. But Marcus responded to that injustice with grace, forgiveness, and a determination to help others avoid similar fates. If anyone in this story deserves to be called a hero, it's not Detective Frank Martinez, it's the man whose life he tried to destroy but who refused to let that destruction define him. As I finish telling this story, I want to be clear about why I chose to come forward. It wasn't because I stopped loving my father, I still love the man who raised me, even as I condemn the choices he made. It wasn't because I wanted to destroy his reputation or hurt my family, every consequence of exposing his crimes has caused me pain. I came forward because Marcus Washington deserved to have someone believe him, because Janet Collins deserved to have her real story told, and because the truth matters more than protecting comfortable lies. If there's one thing I hope people take away from this story, it's that we all have the power to choose truth over convenience, courage over comfort, and justice over loyalty. These choices aren't easy, they often come with significant personal cost. But they're the choices that define who we really are, beyond the roles we play or the reputations we try to maintain. My father framed an innocent man to protect his career and his informant. I exposed that crime to protect the truth and seek justice for Marcus Washington. Those two choices, his and mine, show the fundamental difference between self-interest disguised as duty and actual moral courage. I hope that when faced with similar choices, more people will choose the difficult path of honesty rather than the easy path of self-preservation. Marcus Washington is free now, rebuilding his life and helping others do the same. Janet Collins's real story has finally been told. The truth has come out, painful as it was. And maybe, in some small way, justice has finally been served, not through punishment or revenge, but through acknowledgement, accountability, and a commitment to doing better in the future. That's all any of us can do when confronted with the wreckage of past mistakes: tell the truth, accept responsibility, and work to ensure it doesn't happen again. This is Sarah Martinez, and this is how I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is set the record straight, even when that record belongs to someone you love.